and not in our topic area too, in a lot of the urban areas so much, at least in the United States or in Indiana. But want to thank everyone that's joining us either here through our Zoom link today or on our Facebook Live for our Hoosier Birders Hour, kind of our monthly gathering to kind of get around and just kind of chat with the membership. And so, quite frankly, too, it's an opportunity to hear from you guys. If you guys have questions, you want to know, you want to, stump the executive director, whatever you want to do. It's a chance to engage, interact here on a virtual platform since we've gone post-COVID and now we kind of meet in person and do this occasionally. So we're glad whether you're here or Facebook Live watching us. And aside from questions, we do have interesting topics today because we do know that Indiana is a diverse state. There's plenty of rural areas. We're talking about barn owls flying over cornfields, but there's a lot of people that their first interaction with birds occurs in cities and urban areas. And despite what the difference that we think of in the birding experiences, say in a national park and in city park, there's great connections and sparks that occur. And so that's why I actually have some great guests that we've invited here today that I want to introduce. And first is they're all associated with Indiana Audubon in some form, whether a board member, you've helped with trips or projects or initiatives. Some have left us, such as Matt Igleski, who famous Indiana Dunes Birding Festival guide. Is jumped ship from Indiana Audubon's board and is now the captain of the newly named Chicago Bird Alliance. And so certainly plenty of urban birding that goes on there. Andy Belt in Indianapolis works for the state of Indiana government. So you're downtown a lot. And so often interact with a lot of the city and urban birds, the good and the bad aspects of that. And we have Lina Rifai, who's with IU University, Indiana University in Kokomo, where you teach students all about ornithology and are associated in a lot of kind of urban and campus birding research and education. So first off, I want to thank all three of you guys for joining us in addition to everyone else who's logged in today. First question I want to ask, and the first person that knows it, what was your first kind of urban birding spark? Like, what is it that made you go, oh, you know what? There is birds to see and this interests me in the urban landscape.
Well, I didn't live in a big urban area and wasn't a birder at the same time until I was in Chicago. So it was probably 10 years ago when I was working as a high school teacher in Chicago. And so, I think even in these small little kind of green spaces in front of the high school, showing some of those students like how, much life and, things can be around there. And, one of them was birds, right? Like birds move through and change throughout the seasons. And so I think just like kind of having that sort of little area, like right by the high school ended up being like my first, like, okay, like there's actually quite a few things. And living in an apartment on the third floor where, you could wake up in the morning and hear 4, 5, 6 species of warblers singing before you even got out of bed, because you're like literally in the crown of the trees. So I think that realizing that Chicago is this like really great corridor and hearing and seeing all these different birds kind of moving through the different seasons as I was getting pretty much into the hobby of birding really got me like, wow, this is really cool. Like, the urban landscape really does offer like a pretty awesome opportunity to see all these different species.
Amazing how adaptable they are. Lina, Andy, do you guys have urban sparks?
Well, I was busy chasing lizards and snakes and frogs as a kid, so birds were kind of more around, but I grew up in Vienna and Austria, so it was a big city. I would say what really sparked it was a barn owl that I saw in a building, the European barn owl, and didn't really get much into the urban birding until I came to the US and a grad school in the University of Louisville there with the Beck and Bird Club that I joined for a short time, and then with my advisor at the time too, as a birder and an ornithologist, and was pretty amazed at the diversity of birds that I could find, that I didn't have to travel out further into the woods or anywhere else to see all of those different birds. So, and with my students, we take them to urban parks and we see the most birds there a lot of times.
So I grew up in the Indianapolis suburbs. I wasn't a birder for the longest time until I went to IU Bloomington. because of an ornithology class. I
Ooh.
got interested in birding, and as I walked around campus and I started learning about what birds were there, I got pretty close glimpses of red-tailed hawks and Cooper's hawks. And one time I saw a pileated woodpecker just on the sidewalk, eye level. Thought it was just the most gorgeous bird I've ever seen. Used to, I think I remember hearing about them as a kid and thought you'd have to go to a forested area to see these birds. But, as time went on, being a student at IU, I accumulated a small life list of birds on campus. It was nice to be able to see what was there. I also, going downtown and seeing the chimney swifts, being out and about around the evening hours. I miss it, but at least I've got Indianapolis to make up for that.
It really seems like the connection I'm hearing is how, in these urban areas, the habitat is obviously structurally different, but there are a whole suite of birds that seems to have adapted to that. And that these are the things that you guys are calling out, like chimney swifts. They've learned to, into these urban areas, and they have thrived. And so they allow us to have these connections where I really probably not going to have this ooh ah moment with a bunch of chimney swifts, in the middle of a Brown County, where in Indianapolis, you're going to see that. And so there's all these different species now that have these connections to urban areas. So for folks that are, when they get interested in birds, when we ask people, what are your spark bird? In fact, if you're listening, put in your spark bird, because what I can promise you is that we're going to see, if 50 people put in their spark bird, we're going to see almost 50 different birds. And so it doesn't have to be the deep woods wood thrush that is going to connect someone and make them be a birder and a nature enthusiast. And it can be as simple as a bald eagle or a red-tailed hawk or a robin. And what we know from migration and science is that every night in migration, there's thousands of birds overhead, and it doesn't matter whether it's over the Rocky Mountains or, the Iowa Plains or Indianapolis. It's just the same volume of birds that are flying over, and these birds then are coming down. And the habitat that we have in urban areas may not be the best nesting habitat, but there's tons of great stopover habitat that allows us to see these birds. So when you think of birds that are really adapted to urban areas, what is that top 5 list?
Good question. I mean, I feel like I don't know if it necessarily falls into the category of like adapted to urban areas, but I think that urban areas offer a lot of like kind of sometimes unique resources. So I think one of the ones I often really think about, especially in the winter, having just gone up to Duluth and Sac Zim, and the place that you generally see the things like Bohemian waxwings are going to be in the urban area because of all those ornamental fruiting trees and shrubs that are like lining every mall parking lot or hotel parking lot. And so I think that those kinds of resources are less dense in like the more natural areas. And so that's one unique resource that I often see birds using, especially having just come, what I thought was coming out of winter, even though it snowed today, coming out of the winter time, that's a resource I often kind of think of as being like somewhat unique to an urban area as that food resource of fruiting trees.
I hadn't even considered that. Just the fact that the landscaping then creates the food source that they're drawn in. I was thinking more kind of the nesting habitats, but that's a really good one with some of these different frugivores. And I bet you, Lina, like on campuses, I know when we go up to the UP on some of those tours, you go to the campus because that's where they have all the berry trees that are still holding fruit for them.
Yeah. Actually, we get a really great diversity here on campus. But talking about urban ones, I have to also think about the Cooper's hawks, which I know a lot of people of bird feeders don't like to hear about them or want to see them. But I always say the birds too need to be fed, and we have Cooper's hawks here on campus that will nest every year, and they will pick up birds around here. So it's really neat to see, because if you really think of it, it's something that's specialized to hunt more in a forested area. In the urban area, and bird feeders provide food for the birds, including the ones that are going to hunt the birds, so that there's a good source of food for them as well.
we got frugivores, we got Cooper's hawks, urban symbols. What other ones? We know we got chimney swifts.
Pigeons.
Yep. Yeah. Pigeons and house sparrows and starlings. you
Okay,
know?
so
Yeah, I was
then-
gonna say,
so-
do we want to talk about the invasives?
So, what do you say that you got, let's see, 2 species that have naturalized, house sparrow, well, 3 if you got starling, rock pigeon, house sparrow, that we hear stories like, in their native ranges where like house sparrow numbers are going down and that there's even small declines around here, but obviously there are people that are going to, spark with some of those birds as well. Though they have their negative stories that we could talk about, once they leave those urban areas and the influence that they have on some of our native species. They've certainly, deserved recognition to have excelled in that urban landscape. The one that I feel that, I'm most associated with personally is the peregrine falcons. And so here, not only just a species that like a chimney swift that just succeeds in the city, but here's one that we were literally losing. And then the actual habitat that we have been created has allowed this species to come back now that we've controlled the DDT and the fact that certain cities have the webcams. And so right now, if you just Google in and put in like South Bend, Falcon Cam, Fort Wayne, Falcon Cam, there's some other Falcon Cams, and you can see right now the birds sitting on the nest. And I think Fort Wayne, South Bend have about three eggs each, respectively, at this point. And then so that's kind of a neat urban symbol. These have been and dominated some of our urban landscapes, and you get a chance to see, the fastest bird in the world, fly by if you're walking around downtown in one of these places. And so that's definitely one that I think is probably worthy of being on the list.
Yeah, we got some here, and from some people like American goldfinches, which are always fun to see. We actually have 4 bird cams on campus, and it's been very entertaining watching the goldfinches. Currently, always trying to fight with the dark-eyed juncos, and it's a tiny little dinosaur with a little bird that sounds like it's shooting laser guns. So it's been fun watching those little fights. But yeah, eastern bluebird, blue jay. So yeah, those are great ones.
Yeah. Crows, especially,
Oh, yeah.
wintertime. We've seen that some of our urban areas are just a couple degrees warmer. And used to be, like Terre Haute was where that's where I thought of. When you thought of crows, go to Terre Haute, thousands and thousands of crows. But as I've talked to folks around the state, I've learned that this is not a unique phenomenon to Terre Haute. South Bend's got some, and almost any urban area has some area where you have crow roosts of different sizes, generally in the wintertime. And so there's that aspect that we could add to urban birds that are unique.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of crows, I feel like, along the Chicago lakefront. So they definitely use that space much more frequently, to the point where, like, sometimes in the Christmas bird counts that are just a little more interior, especially like Illinois, you might not even see any, like, on a Christmas bird count. Like, they're all on the lakefront, which I think is interesting. The other couple I was thinking about that are probably almost a nuisance but are native are things like Canada geese. They're always like in urban parks and areas, and mallards, gulls. Usually our ring-billed and herring gulls do a great job of using cities and parking lots and all sorts of these spaces that other birds probably would not find very appealing, but those are some of the best places to, even in winter, to go look for some of those rarer other cool gulls that will often mix with our native, I shouldn't say native, but our more expected species that we get in those urban landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Matt, you also, for Chicago, have a pretty significant night heron colony, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's also kind of become an infamous place to go and see black crowned night herons, to the point where it's, the biggest colony in the entire state of Illinois. So you just go to, ironically, the Lincoln Park Zoo, even though they're wild birds, and they're just right there, lining the trees around the wolf and bear and all those habitats, right along a roadway. So they are not deterred at all by, all the hustle and bustle and people and everything that are around in those spaces.
I remember visiting a few years ago to see it, and there was one yellow crowned. And so talk about finding a needle in the haystack, was finding the yellow crown amongst all the black crown night herons.
Yeah, the black ground night herons is also an interesting experience. My first time seeing them in US was in downtown Louisville, and they kept on being chased away as a nuisance because of the mess they made wherever they would roost. And that was very interesting to see how they moved from neighborhood to neighborhood. But it was a little bit sad as well because nobody wanted them around, and eventually I have no idea right now where the roosts are anymore. But yeah, the thunder over Louisville, that's what got them away from the Falls of the Ohio at the time. So they started nesting by the zoo or roosting by the zoo.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I just saw somebody as well mentioning black ground night herons. Yeah,
The
Seems to really like the zoo.
yeah. And
There's
Matt,
a
you guys,
Detroit zoo, there's a National Zoo Colony.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. So I think somebody said St. Louis Zoo maybe or something else, but yeah, it's really neat. And Matt, you guys also have the monk parakeets there. They're
Yeah, monk
Quakers.
parakeets. Yeah, they've decided that the underside of the toll road is a great place to make a bunch of nests. So yeah, usually if people want to see them, I send them down to the south side, and you just kind of look up at the underside of the toll road, and you'll see all these giant stick condos being constructed, or
Yeah.
and I always tell people, listen, you'll usually hear some squawking and noise, and then that's how you know that they're around. But they're another one that's really interesting because they're really impressive when they start moving around. So like if you run into like a flock flying in around someone's backyard or in one of the parks nearby, it's really fun to see. And I think I might actually hold the record, even though it wasn't technically in Chicago. It was actually technically in Indiana for the highest count for it might be the state. It was like 72 monk parakeets all together in the field feeding on all sorts of little kind of like seed heads and things. And when they took off, I took a few photos, and yeah, it was a huge flock just hanging out right along the toll road there.
Yeah, there are actually a few states where it's illegal to breed them and sell them. Like Kentucky, for example, I remember a friend got them one in Indiana and brought it over to Kentucky. I was like, you can't have that over here.
Yeah, they're a
Yeah, we
nuisance
have
in a lot of those states where they will build their nests, those big stick nests on like power poles, and like actually by closer to me where I live, which is in Hammond, there is this big cell phone tower by a roofing company. And that's generally one of the places that you'll see them building stick nests. But those companies will often, after a period of time, rip those nests down and try to deter them from continuing that because it can, mess up transmissions or whatever is happening at those places. So I know in the South, it tends to be a bigger issue. Fortunately, I feel like the toll road, it's the underside of like basically a highway, and that seems to be not a spot that they care too much about controlling them. So they seem to do fairly well and have used that almost as like a corridor to spread, I think, throughout to some of the suburbs now too. And so you actually will see them in a lot of different locations along that toll road, especially heading west out of the city.
But talking about those cell towers, the turkey vultures, they love urban habitats. At least we have them circling over campus. And I've seen 20 or so sitting on towers and just waiting around. So it's really neat to see those. And a lot of times we get questions about those. What are those? And I think I saw a bald eagle up there, and there's 20 bald eagles sitting up there. Like, not quite. So
Yeah, you guys got some other species I hadn't thought of, those monk parakeets, the way they're expanding. And but it's interesting with monks, if you go to eBird and just look up the map and see like where their native ranges, much farther south, and just see how much they have really kind of expanded out into small populations that kind of persist for a while. Sometimes they fail. Indianapolis had monk parakeets for a while. And just the climate up here, they generally don't persist, where Chicago's been a little more unique. Generally farther south. I remember in December being in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and just everywhere. You're throughout the city. They're flying all over the place. But as there's more species coming in, that I think the ABA just accepted, the European goldfinch now is on the official list. And there's been a big population that was released in Chicago that has expanded primarily north and south, but we do have records in Indiana now, and so it's assumed that the Bird Records Committee then would have a process to accept it. These records now the ABA has, and so potential new bird to be looking out for if you're in some of these urban areas, or that's expanding European goldfinch. And I've seen them just a couple times. Man, do you run into them regularly?
No, I mean, so they're actually pretty. The real like stronghold is actually pretty far north out of Chicago. It is still an urban area, but it would be more like Waukegan. So like Waukegan Beach is generally where if you spend enough time in a day, you kind of wander around there, you'll eventually run into them there. The only one I've ever seen around in Chicago had a little pink band, so I'm pretty sure it was not one from that wild. But you never know. Like once it starts mixing, maybe finding that flock, it
Yeah.
muddies the waters about like what you accept as a record or not. So because obviously that's how they got established. And so yeah, I have yet to see one, I think, officially in Cook County, but certainly Waukegan, that north area closer to the Wisconsin border, you tend to see like pretty good sized flocks there.
It looks like somebody was mentioning the purple martins. It's actually just last week I saw my first one at Eagle Creek Park. So yeah, there's a lot of really successful places that they've been able to bring them back. And if it's not overtaken by house sparrows or strawlings, those purple martin houses, it's actually really neat to see them in downtown areas, even, well, downtown in parks and Indianapolis.
Speaking of purple martins, I actually just saw a news story recently about the Nashville Symphony trying to remove the purple martin roosts near their building. I think they're trying to cut down the trees so the purple martins aren't pooping everywhere. But I think it's a sad story because I believe Nashville prides itself as an urban bird area. And here they are trying to deter purple martins, which are their population is declining.
That's
Yeah.
a species I don't automatically associate with urban, but yeah, the fact that here's a species that's completely dependent on humans now and in the nesting structure. So I guess it's a suburban bird.
Yeah.
That's certainly one that is also associated with human and urban birding areas. Are we missing any others? There's actually a lot more than I thought of these really kind of unique birds of the urban areas that are worth seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like depending on the city, I mean, any city really, like especially during migration, you can get anything. But I do think of like, especially like the winter time being like one of those times where like we do get these like interesting, unique species that tend to hang around. At least for Chicago, the lakefront, not this year, but in other years, snowy owls tend to be one that you can often actually like find fairly easily if you spend enough time going up and down the lakefront. Same with if you're really diligent and looking at every sort of like dense vegetation, you can often find long-eared owls. We'll get long-eared owl roosts right in the city. There was some spotted right by like there's like a fruiting tree over a sidewalk, on the South Loop this winter. So there are species like that seem to do fairly well, or at least seemingly well. They're not seemingly disturbed by people. Saw-whet owls, there's probably lots. Once you start thinking of other things besides buildings and just that park space, things like cemeteries or some of the larger parks that we have in Chicago, saw-whet owls are probably even more common than we realize just because they're so hard to detect. But yeah, there's definitely places where people have had more than one, several saw-whet owls that probably have hung out all winter. And then once you're getting out of sort of like winter into the spring migration, I feel like Chicago, at least it's positioned as kind of almost like a pinch point, right? Where it's right along the lakefront. And so really any migrant bird that's going to be moving from the south to north or vice versa has the potential to come through Chicago. And I think that's what's so interesting about, birding places like the lakefront, like Montrose, of course, which everyone maybe has heard of as being this little migrant trap that sticks out into the lake, is that literally anything that, is looking for a place to land ends up there. And so just the amount of really unique and rare birds that show up there, but also the kind of harder to find regularly occurring birds like Connecticut warbler, things like that, you can often get pretty easily at Montrose eventually, as long as the timing is right. And so I think it's just like a lot of surprises when you tell people like Chicago's a great place to go birding. because they don't probably think of urban areas as being a great place to go birding, but really Chicago offers a really unique, I think, little area along the lakefront that is all parkland, right? You know, a lot of urban areas, especially along bodies of water, give up all that land as privately owned, and then it becomes hard and inaccessible. But in Chicago, it's this big, long, contiguous park space for the most part, which offers a lot of habitat for birds to hang out. And so I think that that also is something that's really interesting about at least how accessible it is to get to some of those areas in a city like Chicago.
And that migrant trap effect.
Yeah, I was going to say I mean, that's a nice thing. We see quite a few rare birds, or birds you wouldn't expect during migration. But yeah, it's interesting to see, because as urbanization is growing and we're going to have more suburban and urban areas, to see how these birds are using that habitat during migration. And it was just last fall where we, on campus, you know, we're banding here doing research, got a whippoorwill. Never expected to have one stopover. It was also a little bit late during migration, but lots of very interesting warblers that we would usually not see, of course, in the breeding season, because they're either just migrating through. But they seem to use these, and we don't have a very wooded campus. It's not like the Bloomington campus that Andy got to experience. So, but still, it's a little stopover site. It's enough, you know, to provide some habitat for these birds as they're migrating.
There's pockets of green space in Indianapolis, and I mean immediately downtown. Like there's parks that are surrounding Indianapolis, like Eagle Creek and Fort Harrison. But then you have places like Military Park and Riverside Park, and I believe the mall that's next to the I can't remember the name of the museum, but those spaces will attract a lot of different birds during migration, and you'll just see them popping out from under the bushes, and people will come up to you and be like, "Hey, what are you looking at?" There's this little warbler that's just underneath the ornamental bush over there.
Yeah.
The birds are popping out of the bushes, not the people, right?
Sometimes I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always
You
have a
literally
hard
have
time. I was gonna say I
so
always
you
have
have
a
the
hard
same
time.
amount of birds in
Yeah.
that same, you know, in a smaller area. So it's almost like you get, because of that migrant trap effect, because of the urban around you.
Yeah, I was gonna say I always have a hard time answering that question though when people do ask you. You're like, "What are you looking at?" And you're like, "Do you want the very specific answer, or do you want like you
Yeah.
know?" Like...
or did you see anything interesting? I'm like, well,
Yeah.
it depends what you think is interesting.
Right. Yeah, I feel like that's the thing that you deal with a lot more probably in an urban landscape, is people kind of like talking to you a little more often. Like, what are you doing? And you're like, it feels obvious, like I'm looking at birds, but like, you know, like what, you know, so it's like a hard thing sometimes for me to hone that sort of answer, especially when springtime comes around again, because I know it's going to come often when you're kind of walking through a lot of the parks.
And it is really fascinating to see how the birds have adapted to that movement. A lot of what seems to, you know, that they will hunt and feed while people move by, and most people won't notice. I remember once or twice where it happened on campus, there's a red-tailed hawk chewing on a squirrel right next to a building, and nobody has noticed it. And I sit there and watch, and it's like everybody walks by and the hawk just continues tearing up that squirrel.
We at the Dune State Park, obviously, you know, the most visited state park in Indiana. So a lot of people come up the tower and you got a scope. What are you looking at? You do a lot of bird stories, but you know, sometimes you just want to have fun, you know, whales, and you know, see how many people do that. The body, you know, just say that.
Watching my neighbors.
Yeah. I think the nice thing though about like birds in urban areas like that though is that I think they get you know, desensitized, or their flight distance is closer, so I feel like a lot of times too that offers a little bit like better experience, or at least makes it actually easier to see some species of birds. You know, when you're out in those bigger landscapes where the birds can get away from you, it can be a little more frustrating, versus if you're in a park where you can literally walk around literally every single tree. It gives you like a little bit more of an opportunity to kind of like really see a bird, because you know the number of times I've been on trail 2 or 10 or something, and the bird, you know, in the state park, and the bird takes off the other way, and you're like, it's gone. Like there's just no way for me to find it now. Whereas if I'm in one of these urban parks, I can probably kind of like get closer to it. I can see where it landed. I can walk walk over there. It seems like much rarer for me to not be able to pretty much identify everything that I encounter in an urban park, whereas warbler spot ends up on my list a lot more, like when I'm in those other kind of more natural areas.
I think many people got their lifer clay-colored sparrow in, I think it was December or November of 2022, and I found it next to the state capitol building. And it's just so easy to spot. You could just walk right up to it without using binoculars and know that it's a clay-colored sparrow. But it stayed there for a long time. I don't think anything was wrong with it. I just think it found a place where it could forage and find cover from the elements.
Mhm.
Yeah, saw my first whooping crane in Indianapolis, looking up, watching sandhill cranes fly over, and I was like, "Hold on, one of those is not the same."
It's a good urban record to have. Yeah, ideally,
Clay-colored sparrow is a backyard bird for me. I got that as a backyard bird.
Even the state capitol, go 10 or 15 years earlier, there were a lot of birders that got their lifer yellow rail that was running around out there too a few years back, I remember. So really, you're seeing. Yeah, Andy?
I feel like the number of photos I've seen of things like that, I can't say I've never, but I don't think I've encountered too many like myself, like really cool observations like that. But yeah, always, like almost every year, yellow rail in someone's like alley, or like something kind of just blows your mind, like a bird that just decided to stop, maybe for bad reasons, which I think is the other kind of flip side of these like urban landscapes, right? Is that it's also sometimes a veritable gauntlet of hazards and things that those like migratory and native birds have to sort of navigate. And so with rails and woodcocks, which are starting, have been coming through, they tend to fall victim a little bit more often, it seems like, just bright lights that draw them in, and then they hit buildings, and then there's cats in urban landscapes and all these other things. And so definitely we haven't made it easy for a lot of these birds to persist, which I think is also more impressive, how many still do go through unscathed. But it's definitely, it makes you think, once you start knowing some of those hazards, when you see those photos of the yellow rails or whatever, you're like, like hopefully it's okay. Hopefully it still makes it to where it's supposed to be going, especially when it's a species that's declining, or not having a lot of success, so
endangered.
You really feel for it. Yeah.
It really, because it shows you every bird that you're getting all over the state is occurring in these urban areas, and so it all comes back to that migration at night. And let me show you a picture. I'm going to share this in an urban area. This was we actually installed a radar a few years ago up at the Indiana Dunes State Park, and this radar ran for a couple seasons, doing both a vertical and a traditional radar. And this is a 30-second snapshot at 8 a.m. in early mid-March. I'm sorry, mid-May. And so the sun has been up for a couple hours, and every little streak you see there is a bird, and it's color coded by the direction that bird's going. You can see the little pie chart in the corner. And so this is showing you, look at all those birds flying at 8 a.m. But if I close this out, look at what this same spot looked like 4 hours earlier before sunrise. There it is. Yeah, right there. And so go from that one image to this image, where the streaks are just overlapping each other. And I think that if you could take, any of these areas, particularly urban areas, because we know these birds are being drawn to the light. So in some sense, the birds migrating over urban areas are even higher than rural areas. And if at 2 a.m. you could just like turn on the light and look up, it would blow our mind, the birds that are flying by. And so obviously with that, you get the big diversity. It allows for the bird watching opportunities, but then it also creates these different risks that the urban areas have for birds, you guys have alluded to. And Annie, one that you're probably most familiar with of all of us is some of the bird collision, particularly down in Indianapolis, since you're prone to be walking to work and running into that. And do you see a lot in a variety, and are certain times that you see it the worst?
So when I go into work first thing in the morning, I'll usually check the windows of my building, and I don't see anything. I'm not sure if cleaning crews have already been through and take care of the birds. But sometimes I'll come hours later and I'll just see a warbler just next to the window. Occasionally, I found. I think there was time last year I found woodcock on 3 different occasions that just hit a window. A couple of those times flew off, but there are buildings that are worse than others. Some that have huge glass windows, and those have more window strikes than other buildings, unfortunately. But I used to go out with Austin Broadwater and others to record and find which buildings had the most window strikes and see if we could communicate with them and help fix their problem and hopefully save some birds.
Yeah, I'm doing a study on campus, or I did for a few years with window hits too, and fall migration seems to be the worst. It's where we get the biggest diversity and number of birds, and a lot of it is people really don't know. We in the birding world, I think we're so used to it that most people who are not aware of that don't know that birds migrate at night and will be drawn towards the light. So we've definitely been able to minimize some of that by letting people know, even putting down blinds in the offices, turning off certain lights, and it's definitely gone down the number and also number of species, so the diversity of birds hitting windows. But fall migration is definitely the big one for us here.
Yeah, the state capitol building, where I've seen a lot of good birds, they have these spotlights that they will have turned on all night during migration. I mean, that brings in the birds, but then some of them, succumb to window strikes. So it's not a great habitat, but hopefully in the future they'll be able to accommodate for different migratory species.
Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, we had our single worst day, I think, last fall in Chicago, where
Yep.
it was about 1,000 just at
Yeah.
McCormick Place, and I think twice that in the rest of the city. So unfortunately, there's a need for these collision monitors, but we have this dedicated group, the Chicago Bird Collision Monitors, that go out and monitor a lot of the buildings downtown and walk around in the morning and pick up all these birds. And so just that one day last year, October 5th, there were just like 3,000 birds between McCormick Place and the rest of the city that hit buildings and died.
Yeah, actually one of my student groups in ornithology was working on a project for diminishing window hits, and they used that. So thanks, Chicago. You gave them a good example.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately now it seems like McCormick Place is finally, after a long time, going to put some strategies in place to mitigate this, which you can see because they're kind of a public entity. So they have these bids out right now to put films on the window, create electronically drawn shades. Apparently it was very hard for them to draw the shades at night, which was a need because they're turning over these event spaces for things in the morning, so they had to have lights on for the workers. So there was reasons why the lights were on. It wasn't just like they left them on, but there was also no reason for them not to have thought about mitigation at this point, because it's been a problem for many years. And so our group is one of a few that's in this coalition called Bird Friendly Chicago, where we're hoping to eventually get Chicago to adopt a full ordinance. Right now they have sort of subset of the sustainability list, which is for a subset of projects that happen in the city, where they can kind of at least encourage buildings to do these bird-friendly measures, but at the moment it's not required. And there's a lot of other things that they can do to earn with basically points on this list as they're building these projects. And so we're hoping that eventually we can kind of move more towards an actual ordinance, which New York City actually already did, and some of our surrounding areas up here have, our
Addison, right?
northern suburbs, Evanston and Skokie, have actually adopted the ordinance that the group wrote, but Chicago has yet to adopt it. So we need a lot more big urban areas to adopt these these regulations for new construction, especially.
Yeah, and the areas like Chicago, because you're in those flyways, so these urban areas have denser numbers because they're funneling up the lakeshore areas. And unfortunately, those events you see that happened at in Chicago in October, but that's like every 2 or 3 years. Like the number, like there's hundreds nightly, and then there's thousands on these major events that seem to happen just every couple of years. So it's like this isn't a standalone event. And this is the one that the public noticed and saw that the media carried, but they missed the 500 that was a week ago
Yeah.
because it wasn't big enough of a story. And so I think for me, I grew up, originally birding in Steuben County, pretty rural area, moved to the dunes. You're kind of on that edge of the urban area, and I kind of was able to dance back and forth. And now that I've had more experience with bird collision and being in a downtown area, until you actually see it for yourself, the pictures, like seeing the pictures of the Canadian Rockies, it doesn't do it until they're there. And seeing that picture of 300 dead birds, it's moving, but it doesn't quite do it until you're there. And I remember an incident where I wanted to take my wife and, hey, look at all these birds that are gathering and see this impact of what's going on. And we got there, and there was a woodcock in this little alcove, and she was, oh, woodcock, my favorite bird. And she wanted to rush for it and grab it. And the minute that happened, that woodcock took off, and right into that glass wall, and it died instantly. And it's unfortunate that would take that kind of an event to really drive it for people and see it. And so that's why I say, go see this issue in person. Help out. If you're in Indianapolis, Bird Safe in Indy, you got Austin Broadwater and a coalition of folks that are out there checking downtown. And so you can really learn about what that issue is and why they're talking about regulation and these big, tough things that are going to be accomplished, and why they're so important, I think. And so it wasn't for me till I saw it that I really realized the magnitude of the issue.
And yeah, I saw there's some questions there about, what kind of film to use and all of that. And Whitney already answered in the chat, but if you haven't seen it, there's Bird Safe Indy website, the American Bird Conservancy, ABC, birds.org. They have done all the research. They have really good data on that to make sure that whatever you put on works well. And somebody else asked about what research there is, which side of the building they hit. It all depends what kind of glass it is, if it's fall versus spring migration. So there's a lot of those, but yes, there've been a lot of studies done on that. And for campuses now to also have different, I know with an IU to get a certain standard for example, for the sustainability office, and for every new building that's one of the ways you can get points to get to that standard of having buildings, sustainable and environmentally safe, and all of that is also to make it more bird hit proof. Yeah.
Those measures and policies won't just help birds, but also other animals that migrate. I've also found bats outside of my building. A silver-haired bat that I thought may have been a window strike had been hanging outside of my office, and I think I had also seen a brown bat a couple of years before that. So they do run into windows in the city, along with migratory insects. So it's just a good thing all around to improve how your windows are working.
Yeah, and so I talked about rehabbers. So I worked with a rehabber and had some students do internships there. Actually, one of them is in this life. But yeah, the issues with a lot of times when birds hit the windows, they have internal injuries. So even if they're fly away, they often will die from those injuries. I've seen at bird rehabs how many birds come in with injuries that are too bad for them to make it very long. Some will survive if they get in time there, but sadly, there's a lot of people who want to help but don't know how to. So you see those videos, especially, oh, look, this bird, and it's tame, it's in my hand. It's a bird that's in shock and needs to at least be put somewhere in the dark and quiet, and ideally taken to rehabber, but not handled, the dog shouldn't be around the bird, nor the cat, of course. And of course, that's another problem. Those birds are weak when they leave, and they're more likely to get predated on, which I think somebody here mentioned too.
Yeah. We may not have McCormick Place where we live, but every single house and all those windows add up individually. I remember my folks' place visiting them, and there was a dead black-billed cuckoo outside one day. And just one little tiny window in this house,
Yeah.
and how it happened to hit that. It was so sad that happened. We actually gave out one of the Mumford and Keller Grant Awards the last year or so was with Humane Indiana Wildlife, and they acknowledging that about 80% of these birds with collision oftentimes will die later from internal hemorrhaging, but they were finding an increased survival rate with this oxygenator. And so by increasing the oxygen levels in the bird during that resting period, they were seeing a little higher success in how many birds. And so with some grant funding, they were able to purchase that, and they use that today for some of their suspected collision birds that they intake.
Yeah, the Indiana Raptor Center uses those too. Yeah.
Awesome.
And I think Whitney provided some links for how to find a rehabber. It's via the DNR website, so there's a lot of licensed rehabbers around.
Collisions, obviously, that's kind of the major thing that people think of. With all those people in urban areas that are birding, we know there's a great benefit of having all those birders for citizen science. And so obviously, maybe not for a couple days, but a lot of people are e-birding a lot of these urban areas. And I know that eBird and Cornell is growing in the products that they have available for like land managers to be able to do downloads of this data. They can take these hotspot data, and then they can apply that towards some of their management plans, or maybe some of the actions that they're doing. And so just having birders out there e-birding is great in urban areas. And there's so many hotspots and parks. And no doubt if you're checking some of the more urban counties, you see more checklists. Certainly you probably run into people that are e-birding too, right?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I feel like eBird is like the tool, right? To go and look and see what other people are seeing. I can always live vicariously through everyone else too if I'm not actually out that day, and see like where everyone's been going that day. I think the other thing that's kind of maybe fun about having like so many hotspots and a lot of people is sometimes like it can get a little competitive. Like you can kind of like go like, I want to make sure I'm topping this person. Now that I've moved on from being at the zoo every day at Lincoln Park Zoo, I feel that threat now of someone coming and taking over what felt like my spot the last like 9 years, so you get like very attached to like your patch, and I think that's kind of a fun thing too, because if your patch is one giant huge hot spot, it's maybe not, it doesn't maybe feel like your patch, but now it's like these little tiny hot spots of smaller kind of habitat. You can kind of adopt one and make it your patch and just visit that every day, like whatever is near your house. Recently, well, it was during the pandemic, because that was like the thing to do was to go birding. And so I would walk around my neighborhood in Hammond. And so Purdue Northwest is like a couple blocks away. I said, hey, you guys should make this a hot spot. And so now that's like my hot spot when I'm home, is going over and checking the campus over there and walking around and seeing what's just hanging out there. And that's a great spot because there's a big giant great blue heron rookery that's right behind there, close to the highway. So that's a fun thing to kind of keep track of too. But I think, yeah, with eBird, it kind of like, it's like a way to share, but it's also like a way for you to kind of like, in a way, like claim like this is going to be my spot, and I'm going to try to like add as much data as I can to like this one little area.
And it's a great tool I've used with my students to, you can't do in a semester a whole field research project. So I have them compare data from different habitats. And one thing we definitely, anybody who's e-birding here, e-bird outside of migration season as well, please. That's very helpful to us. It's definitely spring and fall migration is where you have a lot of less breeding season, and winter not as much. So let's see who can get the biggest breeding e-bird list.
Matt, what I would do is get hold of your hotspot reviewer and have them change Lincoln Park Zoo to Lincoln Park Zoo Historical, and have them create a whole new point. So that way you can retain it's like top e-birder for Lincoln Park Zoo Historical.
Well, I know I'm only a few ahead of one of my former coworkers, and he's still there. So I know he's going to surpass me eventually, but it's just one of those things. It's hard to let go once you've had it for so long. Like that was my patch,
I know where to go next now.
Everybody go there. Yeah, pretty cool.
Just stay away from my hotspot here on campus.
One other thing I was thinking about too, like when I was thinking about urban birding, when I knew this topic was coming, is I was thinking about like, we kind of danced around it, but I feel like, especially being somewhere like the zoo, like how your amenities are more accessible. It's more accessible, I think, overall for people a lot of times in urban areas, because especially like the zoo or a lot of parks are paved, but there's also bathrooms, there's also food, there's coffee. Like, when you're walking through the woods, you can't stop at Starbucks real quick and like grab a coffee in the middle of birding. You'd have to like really like stop and drive and go somewhere. And so I think that's another like huge advantage of, to me, like the urban birding kind of like, embracing that sort of style of birding, is that you can like do all these other things that you wouldn't be able to do if you're in the woods 4 miles away from the parking lot. So I think
Or run back into
Starbucks
Starbucks after the coffee.
But I mean, honestly, that's what, that's one of the things I pitch to people a lot of times too, especially at the zoo, is like, the zoo gates will often be open pretty early. Lincoln Park is free to get into, so you can just wander in and out, and then you can use the bathroom, right? Like there's a nice bathroom for you to use, and there's food nearby. There's just a lot of other things that you get to take advantage of when you're doing like sort of an urban birding day. And then maybe you end at like, one of the breweries that's along the river or something. And then you kind of like watch birds while you're still there hanging out and having lunch. So, I think that's another kind of fun aspect of urban birding, is kind of like weaving it in with like some of these other things that you can do throughout the day. It maybe doesn't feel like this morning I'm going birding only, and then I'm going to go do a thing. It's like kind of a part of your morning. It's a part of your day when you're kind of going around.
Food station to food station.
Yeah.
Some of these hot spots are small enough where you can just do a quick check and move on to the next spot. Like sometimes I will check by the GM stamping plant, which is near the Indianapolis Zoo, and look for black-crowned night herons. And other times of year, I'll go to Riverside Park, look for the merlins, and I'll just spend at most like 15-20 minutes, head out, and find more birds.
I think how easy it is I drive down this interstate and you can just look up at a cell phone tower and say, let's see if the osprey are in. And look at that, I just did some urban birding, driving down the road.
Yeah, that's true by us too. You can do that. The other thing I was thinking too is a lot of times what happens to, especially in Chicago and honestly Northwest Indiana, there's a lot of places that I really have to coach people how to get to them, because it feels like you shouldn't be there, like in these like kind of like urban hotspots. And the one I'm really thinking of is the BP Whiting like refinery. Like getting behind there, people are like, but wait, where do I go? And you're like, do you drive down this road?
Sketchy, don't it?
Yeah, and you're going to be in the middle of this sort of Mad Max system of pipes and flames and stuff. And then there's going to be like these really cool gulls. Like there's going to be blackback gull. And, I think Matt Kalazinski found like a glaucous gull like a few weeks ago. So there are these like kind of weird, unique things that in a normal winter, things really congregate there because there's like a warm water effluent coming, I'm sure, out of that. Same thing on the south side of Chicago. There's like this little kind of area that always stays open. So when the lake freezes over, things congregate. And so that's another, I guess, unique kind of habitat characteristic, but also makes it sometimes feel probably unwelcoming. Like there's these like weird little dead ends, and you walk to the river or the lake or something. And then once you get there, you find this like sometimes just like a real nice little cluster of birds just hanging out.
Yeah, it's the same like with airports, like little regional ones or big ones. But I mean, like the short-eared owls, a lot of times are around there. And yeah, it always feels like I'm being a little bit creepy with the binoculars right by the airport.
Yeah, you have to get like a little less bashful, I think, about putting like just like being around people and feeling like you're looking weird or something.
Well, you could also pretend you're playing Pokemon Go. It goes well together.
Yeah. I know we've had snowy owls at like prisons too, like Westville, the prison facility. So that's another one you don't want to stare with your binoculars in towards too. I've discovered. I was thinking that a lot of these urban areas too, there's a connection that because it's where people are, that's where a lot of the chapters are. Audubon chapters, nature groups, often in urban areas. I think of Sassafras and Bloomington and Sycamore and Lafayette. And so there's this platform of a community in those urban areas, and there's a lot of educational opportunities. Combine that with the nature centers that are doing birding trips and events. It seems like if you're in an urban area, you're going to have for Indiana Audubon, we got maybe 1 or 2 field trips a month, around the state. But in an urban area, you're going to have some sort of birding activity being hosted by someone. So there's, in addition to having eBird and Merlin, there's tons of opportunities to get and gather. We got weekly bird walks at places like, Eagle Creek and Fort Harrison and Migration and other places too.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say nature centers in general. It's a great place for birding, like Matt was saying, also the whole accessibility to just be able to sit there and enjoy what comes. I mean, there's a pretty good diversity at some of those nature centers, and for somebody who's new to birding, and that can be a little bit intimidating with people, being around people who are identifying every little warbler, and they're like, "What do you mean they're all just yellow birds?" To just sit somewhere and get familiar with the common birds, and I find a lot of beginners, when I teach my ornithology class, that students feel more comfortable just being able to sit there and observe them and see what they're doing and what they look like close up.
Yeah, up in the urban areas, in nature centers and feeders and parks where they can't fly away into shrubs allows that opportunity. So I think, creates a lot more of that spark. And I'd be curious to, survey like our membership and figure out, where was that spark moment? Because, it's unplanned. And so it can be occurring anywhere. I'd be curious how many people had their first spark bird in more of, a backyard or urban area versus a traditional park or national park site.
Yeah.
I know in some of the links Whitney's put in the chat include some of the different bird walks that are going on. So obviously we have a lot for Indiana Audubon, but hosts a lot of different chapters. And so we have the Discord server where there's a lot of community events. I think there's like 34 upcoming field trips and events that are already on there. And so if you're in there on the Indiana Discord, it's a easy way for you to see that as well. And right now that we've officially passed the first day of spring, it's officially spring, lots of trips up because it's migration. And so, we're planning for the solar eclipse event that we got at Mary Gray, which is a sold out event, but the spring gathering on a special May the 4th be with you day that we'll be hosting at Mary Gray as well. And so there'll be a whole multitude of different kind of birding trips and activities and art workshops and programs, and looking at some of those initiatives and projects that you've been hearing about with Indiana Audubon, such as Chasing Melody, as we're getting ready to kickstart that research project to study the migration movements of wood thrush throughout the entire range of the species. And specifically, we'll be tackling all over Indiana, and you'll be learning more about that. And there's a lot of programs that you can attend related to that. And the big elephant in the room is the Indiana Dunes Birding Festival. And some of you guys may be registered. And I wouldn't be surprised because there are like 650 folks that have already registered in like 3 weeks. So quickly, one of the biggest birding festivals, I think it's up over like, 10, 15% from last year. And so when someone says, I couldn't get into my field trip, you were competing against 600 other people. So, but just message Sam Warren if you're registered for the festival and you're curious about some of these trips. There's people that are constantly dropping and adding different trips. There's 600 people. Lots of stuff happens. So we'll usually get everybody in to have a great birding experience at the Indiana Dunes Birding Festival, and tons of urban birding opportunities there. And I think there are still some openings for our pre-fest trip to take you into Chicago and enjoy some of those birding sites too. So hopefully that's something that's a lot on our mind right now as the Dunes Birding Festival, as we're getting close to that. And hopefully you guys are looking forward to some of the different events in spring migration and doing some of these in urban birding areas. We just had a field trip a week ago looking at waterfowl in Eagle Creek. So there's lots of birds we found even now in March. And so we hope to be able to see you out on the trail. And if you are watching this Facebook Live, feel free to throw in questions. We'll continue to answer them. And we just are glad that you guys are part of our community of conservation and enjoying the bird world with us and helping to save it through research, conservation, and education. So for you guys that are with us, I thank you for everything you guys do. And thanks for being an Audubon member. So thanks, everybody. And we'll see you again next month.